Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith. And today we are going to discuss authentic truth. But before we get into that, I want to mention to our listeners, we're coming up upon our one-year anniversary as Catholic Studies Academy. And so I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our listeners and all of those who have subscribed to our courses. We've created over 100 half-hour lecture courses on all sorts of topics in theology and philosophy. We've created over 40 podcasts, which have been listened to over 6,000 times. And so I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us here at Catholic Studies Academy for your support and your continued support as well. And so I want to ask you all to help us out, help us to continue to grow by sharing our content, subscribing to our podcasts, however you listen to them, however you get them, but also checking out our YouTube video and some of the other content we have at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. And if you're so inclined, subscribe to our courses. With our courses, you'll receive formation in philosophy and theology from a Catholic perspective, where our professors draw on the rich tradition of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years, and if you're studying philosophy, beyond that. And so I just want to thank all of our listeners there. So today we thought it would be good to continue our discussion with authenticity. And so in our last podcast, we talked about authentic beauty and how the beauty lies in the reality of the thing, and that beauty really is the goodness of the thing being shown through, coming through. And so today we want to talk about authentic truth, especially important today because we know of the attacks, particularly coming from the area of relativism, where truth is attacked on all sides, or it's just simply denied altogether. And so, Dr. Smith, let's go ahead and get started with authentic truth. Maybe we can begin by maybe talk a little bit about this kind of dictatorship of relativism, as Pope Benedict XVI talked a lot about in his pontificate.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That's that phrase, that idea, that insight of Benedict XVI. It's really crucial and points to, I think you could say, something like a crisis of truth that modern man suffers under. What he was really referring to there was the way in which oftentimes we think of the relativity of truth as something that sort of secures our freedom. But in fact, it actually has the reverse, right? It actually makes us subject to the tyranny of passion. One of the things that's interesting right there, you think about what is relativism, right? Relativism is the view that truth is relative to an individual, to a time, to a group, or to a historical period, right? So that truth changes, and truth can even be opposed to truth, even in its own time, right? So it's a denial of the unity of truth. It's a denial of the consistency of truth. It's a denial of the immutability of truth. And Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, then soon to be Pope, this was in 2005, rightly recognized that kind of relativity with respect to truth actually brackets truth, removes truth from the table, and brings in really the possibility of a kind of almost tyranny of passion or of will, right? If you remove the truth, right, from your analysis, from your perception, from your experience of things, then really all you're left with is, well, what do I want? What do I feel like? What do I desire? Right? And all of life really becomes subject to that kind of domination of desire and will.
Yeah, and I think it's with truth, we have that there has to be, we understand that there has to be that standard. And, while a lot of times it gets denied wholeheartedly, when you get down to concrete examples, most people, I don't think, are relativists. Because, you simply ask them a question, okay, name one time when rape is okay. They'll have a hard time naming a circumstance where rape can be okay. When I think you have these conversations on a one-on-one level, and you get into these, you can establish that there are some objective truths, but maybe somebody will say, well, okay, so there's some, maybe one or two, but
Right.
most truths are relative.
Sure. Yeah.
So how can we maybe get a deeper appreciation of truth, and its specifically in its relationship with what a thing is, because
Yeah, sure.
that's where we found beauty. So
That's right. Right. Yeah. You want to drive back to reality there, and you really have to kind of train your mind almost to bypass certain kind of common modern errors
yeah,
that we run into in order to get back to the reality of truth. As you say, I mean, I agree. There are very few people who are consistent relativists, right?
yeah,
I mean, you might be able to find some, hardcore relativist in, maybe academia, but most people, even most academics, aren't really consistent relativists. They'll be relativist about something or the other,
mm-hmm.
right? But relativism does become kind of a position that they fall back on,
Right,
in different areas of life, and oftentimes that is related to the idea of what I call sentimentalism, and that is the view, often unspoken, but that sentiments and feeling, right,
mm-hmm.
the ultimate criteria for truth, right? That basically, my feelings about a given proposition, my feelings about a given thesis, really are the criteria that determine whether it's true or false. I like X or I don't like X, right?
Yeah,
Or I describe so and so as icky, and therefore he would not, be a good presidential candidate or something of that nature. It's showing that really your feelings of repulsion then become criteria for determining the truth of a given proposition about who would be good or bad at a given office. And that, obviously that's, I wouldn't want to say that our feelings are irrelevant, right, to thinking about the truth,
right.
but they certainly are far, far from sufficient. And often they are, often our emotions are irrational. Not always, but often.
Yeah, I always like to, to use the family as as a good analogy and stuff. I mean, just the idea of allowing my children, or to run my family like a relativistic society is just, I mean, it's laughable. Exactly. I mean, it's just something that's in one way so ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Just to allow my children, well, if you feel like that's really something you want to do,
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and put the fork in the outlet. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's this kind of, it's ridiculous. Yet, in our modern society, we have that when it comes to things like gender. If you want to, mutilate your body, oh well, if that's how you feel, like, no, that's not a good thing, and there's, all sorts of different examples that we can draw from, again, because we've not,
Yeah.
like you said, it's not because our feelings don't have a place, but that we've put our feelings at the top of what are the standards of truth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I recently was in a conversation where the person was justifying their belief that God thinks divorce is okay and that it's okay for him to get a divorce because he would be miserable otherwise. It's pretty poor, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
bad reasoning, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's like
it just doesn't follow, right? Your misery is not your misery, right? Your feelings of being miserable or unhappy, right? Doesn't make divorce okay, right? I mean,
yeah.
if maybe you want to mount an argument for that, okay, fine. But let's have the argument. Let's not just fall back to, oh, I'm going to feel miserable otherwise.
Right.
I'm so sorry, right? That just doesn't cut it. Certain truths of the faith are like this, right? When you talk about the cross or
Sure.
divine justice or whatever it may be, right? Like, oh, I don't like that. That makes me feel icky, or just stop it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I get it. Yes, we all have feelings, and sometimes we find some certain truths of the faith very challenging, right? And challenging to our sentiments, but just doesn't follow that they're false because of that.
Yeah, and I think the way this gets played out religiously on a whole, not just not necessarily in Catholicism or anything. So I remember talking to somebody, and they were talking about they moved to a new town, and they were looking for a church, and they went to several different churches, and they're like, Yeah, we just didn't, we didn't feel like what the pastor was saying was with what we believed, and we didn't feel, and she kept going through all of these things, and it was just this process of them finding a Christianity, finding a church that had a form of Christianity that they had formed mostly based on their feelings, and again, justifying particular moral positions and things like that.
Right.
But again, it was this formation of Christianity based on what I think, as opposed to letting Christianity form us.
Right.
And
right.
I think that's kind of one of the key concepts with truth is that truth is not it's not true because we say it is true. We believe it because it is true outside of ourselves. It's what the church preaches and teaches. She does that because it's true, but it is not true because we say it is.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point, Jason. It really gets back to both sentimentalism, but sentimentalism is just one subset of what's in philosophy called subjectivism, right? Which is just the idea that the subject determines truth, right? At a more even broader philosophical perspective, you could talk about idealism, right? Where you talk about the view that the mind is the measure of reality rather than reality being the measure of mind. But all of it sort of circles around the idea that you've alluded to a couple of times here, which is that truth is not based on myself. It's not based on myself as a subject, but something external to myself, external to my psyche, right? Was one way of putting it. Something that's not mind dependent, but what what philosophers call reality, right? Reality, the real, okay, as opposed to the ideal. I'm using this in a technical way here. Ideal sometimes means, lofty aspirations. That's not what I mean here. Ideal means mind dependent, on the subject. Something, think about maybe imaginary creatures or imaginary creatures, right? That would be an example of something that in the technical language, right, would be a being of reason, but not a real being, right? That's something, unicorns don't exist. We can talk about them. We can kind of imagine them. But, that's not a real being, right? Whereas, badgers and fir trees are real beings, right? That's reality, right? It's those things are not mind dependent. They exist whether we like it or not.
Right. Exactly.
There's the key, right? Is that they have an independent kind of existence, an independent kind of truth and intelligibility to them, outside of human thoughts, outside of human wishes, etc., like the law of gravity, right?
Right.
I mean, you can try to think it away, but it's there.
Yeah. I mean, you can have a. I use this very lightly. You can have a reasonable discussion about does a unicorn have wings or not, but you cannot have that same discussion about does a badger have wings or not.
That's right.
Because there's a reality that exists within a badger that it does not have wings. However, because the existence, if you want to use that word, of a unicorn relies solely on our minds, we can change it because it's dependent upon our own minds. And so our minds can change it. Whereas the reality of real things is outside of our minds, and therefore it's not based on our minds.
Yeah, I mean, think about it like this. Imagine that there was this is a weird, maybe kind of sci-fi way of thinking about it, but imagine there was some sort of disease, pathogen, right, that just wiped out the whole human species. Like once all the pictures of unicorns went away and everything, like there just would be no, like unicorn would just fall into nothingness, right? Like, but badger would remain.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
There would still be, badgers and, the planet Saturn. Those would be realities, right? Gravity would still be true even if there were no minds. They would still be real, even if there were no human minds to perceive it.
Right. And so like beauty, which lies in reality, the same goes with truth. Now, St. Thomas calls these the divine names, the transcendentals. Talk about maybe how is God truth? How is he with regards to God's relationship to like the transcendentals, but in particular truth?
Yeah. So the transcend, I would just make a distinction here that the transcendentals are included among the divine names, but there are
Okay.
divine names that go beyond the transcendentals, right? For example, like immutability.
Right.
And when you're thinking about the transcendentals as applicable to God, we still want to be a little bit careful and say that they're applicable analogously, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for all of my Scotistic friends, we are not going to apply truth here univocally to God, but still analogously.
Okay.
With all due respect. So sorry, I am a Thomist,
Yeah.
but but there, St. Thomas is really in the mainstream here of Western thought, Christian thought, and endorsing the idea of the transcendentals, right? So there's a way in which we can say of all being that it is true. I think it's easiest to talk about that level, and then we can talk about it sort of in relation to God. What does it mean to say that all being is true? Well, there's a couple of ways of putting this. One is that being, and this is just like right in the teeth of modern philosophy, a lot of modern kind of ideas, but being by its very nature is knowable and intelligible to the human mind, right? So that being is sort of self-disclosing, right? It's keyed to the human mind to be known, right? And the human mind is keyed to being, such that it's really, you have to like go Cartesian, right? To really try to get being away from you, right? It's actually, being is just manifest. It's only sort of modern philosophers who, engage in this radical turn to the subject, who end up losing being and then having to try to trying to reattach us to being, right? Through different philosophical arguments. But rather the idea is that being, by its very nature, as reality, is keyed to being known by the human intellect. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it's true of all being that it is knowable.
Mm. Yeah, and that's and again, the distinction there is that the reality of the being does not lie in the fact that it is knowable, but because it is being, is right. Knowable.
That's right. Very good. Yeah, that's important. I mean, when St. Thomas would want to describe this, he says, "Look, the ultimate object of human intellect is being. Mm-hmm. You can't. One way of thinking of this is why he says that being is that which first falls into the intellect." He's not saying we all are born automatically, sophisticated metaphysicians, right? But rather that we can't think nothing, that we always think things in terms of being, right? And what that shows to us, we can't even speak that like in a different way and make any sense at all, right? So what that indicates for St. Thomas, right, is that being is the ultimate object of intellect. And that intellect is actualized in its knowing processes through contact with being. Mm-hmm. So anytime there's thinking going on, there's some connection to being. Yeah. Even if it's sort of misguided or distorted, you're only thinking if you're thinking being, right? Which I think is a really important point about modern man, right? I mean, one of the key aspects of modern man is the oblivion of being. Mm-hmm. That we've fallen away from being, and that's almost kind of I would argue that that's one of the defining characteristics of modernity. And it really traces back to the work of Immanuel Kant, right? Where he sort of says, look, we've got our experience, but that's just phenomena. We have no idea the way things are in themselves. We have no idea about reality in itself. We just know it as we kind of experience it subjectively, right?
Yeah, you can't know anything. I mean,
that's right. Yeah. You can know your own experience, and that's it, right? Yeah. And that kind of pushes back into that sentimentalism. Kant himself wasn't a sentimentalist, but you can see how framing the issue in that way, right, might lead you towards sentimentalism.
And I would also add, I mean, that's one of the most, as a human person who desires to know the truth, that's one of the most depressing positions to take. Because I mean, we as much as we love to talk about our feelings, one of the places where our feelings come in here is that as human persons created in the image and likeness of God to know the truth, there's also a desire to know the truth. It's not like we're lazy about, if I know the truth, cool. If I don't, oh well. No, there's a strong desire for us to to know the truth, but then also from that knowing, there's also that draw to incorporate your life into that truth, or kind of cooperate with that truth, conform your life to whatever that truth is.
Yeah, right. Nobody wants to live in unreality. The way, in Fides et Ratio, John Paul II talks about this idea that in truth, man finds himself, right? Realizes himself, right, in his full dignity. And this, traces all the way back really to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle opens the metaphysics with the important line that I bring in almost every time I teach Introduction to Philosophy, which is all men by nature desire to know. That is, we have a natural inclination to understand and to try to, or at least to try to understand. Now, to be sure, distorted often by sin and laziness and so forth. But it is there, right? And in some ways it avenges itself on us at certain times, right? Yeah. When we go through a period of purposefully being distracted and deluded, right? That desire for truth has a way of sometimes reasserting itself, whether we like it or not. In the last episode, we also talked about the idea that, that beauty is the appearance of the good. And one way I think of thinking about truth is to think of truth as the appearance of being, right? That is, that truth is being made manifest in the mind. So that this might sound a little obscure, but I think this is a helpful way of thinking about truth is where being sort of shows itself in human thinking. So the human mind is almost a conduit, a display, right? For being in its universality, for its in its unchanging principles, ultimately in terms of its beauty, its goodness, all those sorts of things, right? But that the human person, right, in his intellectual powers, is really where being shows itself, and that all of our arts, our culture, our philosophy, these sorts of things are places where we are displaying being. And it might sound odd, but that's actually, I think, part of our flourishing. Like that's actually, we're set up to do that, right? And we find ourselves and realize ourselves, I think, in that task.
Yeah, so I think it's a beautiful way to put it, and I think it's a way that not only shows that we are made in the image and likeness of God because these things are knowable, we desire to know them. And in that way, you can really see how there's kind of this incarnational aspect of being coming into the intellect, enlightening our minds, so that we can think like God and see the world as He designed it, as He created it. So I mean, I think in a real way, this not only shows God's power and majesty in His creation, but it also should lead us back to God in a very real way. So I think truth has that power, which...
Sure. St. Thomas takes this up in his questions on truth in the Summa and other places, but this is in some ways a really Augustinian theme that St. Thomas appropriates. So one of the things you might note, right, is that earlier when I was describing the way in which truth is a transcendental property of being, or is said of all being, that I said that all being is potentially knowable, right? That's different from saying actually knowable. And the actually known, right? To put it more strongly. And to really fit the definition of being a transcendental, it needs to not just be potentially knowable, but actually known, right? That is, it's actually the truth of being is actually contained in an intellect, right? And of course, what St. Thomas thinks is that that's true of God, right? So that when we think about God as true, let's describe this in his way, is that all being is that truth is based on a relationship between being and mind. He says, well, all being is related to God's mind, right? As the artifact is related to the artisan. So here we have a slightly different meaning of truth. The meaning of truth that we've been talking about is the kind of truth that Thomas would call speculative. Now, I've talked about that word before. Speculative here doesn't mean you're guessing, right? Or betting, right? Speculative here means just looking, observing, right? So it's a kind of descriptive truth. You could put it that way, right? Whereas the kind of truth where you talk about the relationship between the artifact and the artisan is what he could call a practical kind of truth, the kind of truth that exists between the exemplar in the mind of the carpenter
Mm-hmm.
and the finished product,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So if the table fits your plan, right, the plan of the carpenter, then in that way we can say it's true because it corresponds to the plan in the mind of the carpenter. Does that make sense? You know? So all of being has that relationship to God, right? Now this is really interesting because it reverses a little bit of what we were talking about before here.
Right.
In the practical order of truth, mind is the measure, right? That is, the plan in the mind of God is the measure for being, right? And that really sets the stage for our ability to know the truth descriptively, right? Our mind has to conform to reality, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think an important point to add to that would be that, and maybe I'm going too far with this, but I think sometimes when people understand it that way, or you say it that way, it sounds almost arbitrary. That that it just kind of exists in God's mind just to however he feels. They'll say, well, if God said it was that, then he can just arbitrarily kind of change it. But I would say, that is not true. Yeah. So I would say, the existence of it in the divine mind, it's not, it's important. I think it's an important point to add, to say that it doesn't exist nothing exists in the mind of God in an arbitrary sense. Right. That it is there in a beautiful, loving, intricate way. There is some kind of architecture too.
Absolutely.
To those things. So I mean, I just want to throw that out there. I think because
important. That would be a conception that's more sort of alchemist, right? And more moves in the late Franciscan direction, where there's an emphasis on the idea of the absolute power of God over the ordained power of God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just as a side note, several of the Protestant, reformers were reacting to this and criticized this, and rightly so. The more classical position, right, is to say that God always acts in accordance with his own essence and his own divine goodness, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And that essence is immutable. Okay, right. So while there is actually many different things that God could do that God hasn't done, right? God could have created even more creatures or more planets or mm-hmm. whatever, right? Everything he does, he does in a way that's consistent with his own essence, so it's not arbitrary, right? Everything he does in a way that's consistent with his own goodness, and so it's not arbitrary. And so, while maybe he could have designed, as I say, additional creatures, additional stars, or fewer stars, right? That kind of thing. It's nevertheless the case that everything he has done is based on his wisdom and his essence and his goodness. So one of the ways of thinking about this, you think of sort of the top down, right? Mm-hmm. God then, right, in his design, in his wisdom, in his providence, creates things, right? So that his creations are patterned on his own intellect, right? His own wisdom, his own essence. That order, mm-hmm. right, is actually what makes possible our knowing of the creation of God, right? Because it's patterned on his own wisdom, and our minds are patterned to know that reality.
The idea that truth existing in God's mind is just his arbitrary will, kind of a thing. The fact that we can know it in mm-hmm. an organized, systematic way, the fact that we have like systems mm-hmm. of science, I think points to the beautiful design and mm-hmm. love that goes into the architecture of not just making things, but making things knowable.
Right. Yeah,
that fact. I mean, it blows my mind. I mean,
so
I think when you
let me put this in a way that it's a little more contemporary analytic. Either the origin of the universe is rational or irrational, right? And if the origin of the universe is irrational, then there's no good reason to think that the universe is rational mm-hmm. and therefore knowable by the human mind. On the other hand, if the origin of the universe is rational, right, and design things rationally, then it is in fact, then reality as a rational thing is knowable by human reason. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's irrational to think that that rationality came out of chaos.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
You
Yeah, you
know,
have no good reason,
right? You
right,
have no,
to think that the irrational creates the rational, right?
yeah,
There's a dialectical opposition there that should be evident. Um, you can turn that into sort of an apologetic type argument, ultimately, if one likes, and it's useful. But it does sort of point to the way in which truth is tied into reality, and truth is tied into God.
and there's also a big moral dimension also to truth as well. I mean, we have a commandment against offenses against truth, the eighth commandment,
Mm-hmm.
bearing false witness. Like, I think sometimes people can compartmentalize, some of these things, especially when it comes to morality and the Catholic faith, thinking that they can believe the things about God without believing the moral implications of that. But truth does have great moral dimensions, a
Sure.
great moral dimension to it. And that, and I think this is where, conscience comes in as well, or even just kind of that inclination to conform your life to truth. It's a natural desire
Mm-hmm.
of all human people. To
It's
conform
yeah.
their life to truth. I mean, my kids, I mean, they're young, but when they want to know something, I mean, they will not let it go. I mean, they have this strong desire to know it.
From the perspective of classical philosophy and theology, right, we can see that one of the ways in which truth is tied into the moral life and into the life of virtue, in view of the fact that truth perfects the intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, the end of intellect is the truth, right?
Right.
I mean, it's knowing the truth, understanding the truth. Human beings then flourish, right? So you think about what's really desirable for a human being. Well, among those things that are really desirable for a human being is to know the truth, to understand the truth, insofar as you're capable,
Mm-hmm.
And your circumstances allow. That actually is good for us as human beings, and points to one of the real problems with kind of the modern inclinations towards relativism in some areas, at least, right? Because if you start to say, well, all truth is relative, or most truth is relative, or something like that, then really you're impeding, right, the development and the flourishing of the human person, right? Because then they're not going to be able to find the authentic truth, right, which is, as we've talked about, tied in to reality. So one of the best things I think to do when you start to sort of see the relativism sort of emerging as an obstacle, right, is to push back in this direction of the idea that truth is based on reality, which I actually think is really our common sense way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Where we get confused often, I think, on this is the difference between disagreeing about what is true and thinking that truth is based on reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or the difference between figuring out the truth and the basis of truth. So one way I like to put this to students is that whether you're a theist or an atheist, right, or an agnostic, what determines the truth of the existence of God is not your opinion about it, right? What determines the truth of the existence of God is reality, right? The reality of God, right? Or to say, with whether Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, right? It's reality, right? It's the reality about Jesus that makes that belief either true or false, right?
Yeah.
If he did not have a divine nature, if he was not a divine person, then in fact what you have to say is that the belief that he's the Son of God is false, no matter how much you want it to be true or believe it to be true.
Right.
And conversely, right, if he was a divine person with a divine nature, then it's true whether or not you believe it or not. Now, that's different from figuring out what is the truth, right?
Yeah.
But the truth about that is not relative. It's based on reality, which is consistent with itself.
Oh, I think that sometimes in apologetic conversations, that's where we just talk past each other. You have one side talking about how they don't think anything is true based on their feelings. The other side feels a bit frustrated, and they're now in a spot where they have to argue against somebody's feelings. Like practically, practically, it's one of the most frustrating, events to take part in, because they don't go back to that fundamental question of where does truth lie. they begin putting out those arguments for God's existence and things like that. Whereas there's kind of a missed first step of going back to that basic truth, that truth relies in the reality of the thing. So sometimes, and a good analogy is kind of, sometimes when we talk about scripture, I mean, Protestants and Catholics throwing scripture at each other, but many times those arguments always get boiled down to the authority of scripture. Where does that come from? And so in a similar way, I think sometimes when we're talking about different things, whether we're talking to atheists, that we need to go back to that basic argument of, what is truth? Where does it lie? And are certain truths, immutable? And if they are, that there's consequences.
Yeah, I think related to that, sort of the issue about its immutability is the idea that once you recognize that truth is based on reality, not on your feelings, not on your wants, not on your intentions or choices, then one of the things you need to recognize is it can't be relative, right? That is, in this sense, that reality, as I was pointing out about the questions about God or the divinity of Jesus Christ, is one way, right? That is, it's not as if reality is opposed to reality, right? The opposite of reality is nothing, and nothing doesn't exist. Okay, right? So reality is always consistent with itself. I'm going to say make this statement from Aristotle, okay? And it's going to sound weird at first, but it's super useful, okay? So I'll say it twice. All right, so Aristotle teaches that the same thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect, right?
Right.
So
principle of non-contradiction.
That's right. The same thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect. Closely related to other principles. This is so important, right?
Yeah.
It's evident to the human mind, right, as well. Everybody in ordinary life accepts this principle, right? If you were to tell your spouse, well, I am an adulterer and I am not adulterer,
yeah,
right? Well, no, right? Like either you are or you're not, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no in between here, right? Either you are in Paris drinking coffee with Jacques Maritain, or you are not, right? There's just no way around it, right? So that's what it's getting at.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, you have a bowl of soup. That bowl of soup is either hot or it's cold. At that moment, it can be both hot and cold, but not at the same time.
And so what that does for us, right, is to show us that, like, since that's the case, contradictory propositions, contradictory beliefs about reality can't both be true, right? Because either Jesus Christ is the Son of God or he is not. And if he is not, then the affirmation of his divinity is false and the denial of his divinity is true. On the other hand, if the reality is that he is the Son of God, then it's the opposite, right? In terms of the truth and falsehood. So the truth isn't relative because being is consistent with itself. Reality itself is non-contradictory. Reality is, in a sense, you could say, kind of uniform.
Yep, and I think that's hugely important. There's a lot of those basic philosophical principles that can help us out. One thing I do want to point out is that this really goes back to, not to put an ad in, but this is what we're really trying to do at Catholic Studies Academy. And even, what made me think of it was, the title of our podcast here, Take Every Thought Captive. It comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where it reads in verse 4, beginning in verse 4, the weapons of our warfare are not the weapons of the world. Instead, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We tear down arguments and every presumption set against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Truth really sits at the heart of this, and truth lying in the knowledge of God, and part of our flourishing as human persons is aligning our intellect with the mind of God, and we can only do that in truth. We can only align our minds with the mind of God in that way, in the formation of our intellect, and we don't do it so that we're academics sitting in some ivory tower, but we do that so that we can act also in a truthful way. so we can make our entire life kind of that living prayer back to God in truth and beauty and goodness. So Dr. Smith, any final thoughts on truth?
Sure. The alternative to truth, right, is illusion and delusion and fantasy. Fantasy literature has its place, but living in fantasy, living in delusion, engaging in magical thinking is actually, in fact, not good for us in terms of our mental health, in terms of our spiritual health, in terms of our activity as fellow citizens. We need to try to live in reality.
Right.
Eyes wide open and clear minds, right? Oftentimes I pray for my children, clear minds and full hearts. And that's where we want to be, right? We want to see with clarity, right? Striking how often Scripture and classical philosophy invokes the importance of light, right? Because light enables vision, right? If you think about life as a path, if you lack that vision, right, then you don't know where you're going.
Right.
That's bad.
That's so important. And that vision is not just, our intellects, but the grace of God is also there to strengthen our wills so that we can act in a truthful manner. And one last thing that I'll say is, the more I come to know about God and what he has revealed, it really has that aspect of beauty that we talked about last time, of clarity, that it really begins to not just make the picture of who God is more clearer, but it also helps me see the world clearer. I think one of the biggest things that we should strive for spiritually is to see the world with the eyes of God, to see the other human person with the eyes of God. And we can only do that through the formation of our whole person. And so with that, I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. Check us out at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Again, thank you so much for such a wonderful and a blessed year that we've had here. We hope that you'll continue on this journey with us, and we look forward to talking in the future. So until next time, God bless.